My name is Daniel. I've been working the night shift at a small McDonald's on the edge of town for about 3 years now. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it keeps the bills paid, and honestly, I've always been a night person. Standing at the drive-thru window from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. never bothered me the way it would someone else. I actually preferred the quiet of those late hours over the chaos of the day shift. This whole thing started about 6 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday night, probably around 1:30 a.m., and the parking lot was completely empty. I was running the drive-thru alone, which wasn't unusual. After midnight, management never bothered sending more than one person to hold things down. I was halfway through a podcast when a car rolled up to the ordering speaker. The voice on the other end was male, calm, nothing remarkable about it. He ordered a large Big Mac meal with extra pickles and a large orange juice. Specific, but not weird. I punched it in, made the food, and waited at the first window. When he pulled up to pay, he cracked his window just barely enough to slide a card through the gap. His windows were deeply tinted, and the angle of the streetlight didn't help at all. I couldn't make out a single feature of his face. I ran the card, handed back the receipt, and waited, but he just drove away. Didn't stop at the pickup window. Just kept going and disappeared into the dark. I stood there holding his bag for a good 4 or 5 minutes. Then I shrugged and set it aside. By the end of the shift, I ate it myself. People are strange, especially at 1 a.m. I didn't lose any sleep over it. Then, exactly 8 days later, it happened again. Same order, same routine. Car pulls up, window barely cracks, card slides through, receipt handed back. Car drives off without collecting the food. I remember pausing and thinking, didn't something like this happen last week? But I couldn't be sure enough to feel alarmed. I told myself it was probably just two different people who changed their minds. It happens. It wasn't until the third time that my brain finally made the connection. The order was identical. The card swipe, the tinted window, the vanishing act. And something about the timing, the voice, the specific combination of items, clicked in my head all at once. This was the same person. The same guy had come back 3 times, paid for a meal, and driven off without taking it. Every single time. I didn't say anything to management. Honestly, the food was paid for, and I was the one benefiting. I started looking forward to it in a way I'm not entirely proud of. Every 4 or 5 nights, this mystery guy would show up between midnight and 3 a.m. and essentially buy me a free meal without explanation. I started calling him the ghost customer in my head. Then one night, everything shifted. It was around 2:15 a.m. I heard that now familiar voice through the speaker. He started with the usual order, and I was already reaching for the cups when he added something at the end. Something that turned my blood cold. He said, "Oh, and Daniel, I hope those Big Macs have been treating you well." I stopped moving completely. My name is Daniel, but my name tag only says D. Company policy. We don't put full names on badges. There's no board, no poster, no receipt, nothing customer-facing that has my full first name on it. There was absolutely no normal way this man should have known it. I stood frozen for what felt like a full minute. Then I leaned into the speaker and asked, voice cracking, who he was. I asked how he knew my name. I must have repeated myself 4 or 5 times. He never answered, and this time he didn't even pull forward to pay. I heard his engine accelerate and then silence. I spent the rest of that shift barely able to function. I kept checking the parking lot through the window. Every pair of headlights made my heart jump. Something was deeply wrong and I knew it. But I had no idea what to do with that feeling. When I got home just after 5 a.m., I found something tucked under my doormat. A folded piece of paper. Handwritten. Block letters. You owe me. You have 4 days. No signature. No explanation. I sat on my kitchen floor and read it probably 20 times. I have no idea what I supposedly owe anyone. I'm a 26-year-old guy who works nights at McDonald's and spends his days off watching movies and going to the gym. I don't have enemies. I don't have secrets. I don't have a complicated past. Nothing about my life makes sense as a target for something like this. I didn't sleep that morning. I kept every light in the apartment on and sat on the couch waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The next night, I forced myself to go back to work. And of course, he came back. This time there was no food order. He pulled up to the speaker and told me to get a pen. I didn't even have time to respond before he recited an address. It was somewhere on the far edge of the county, a road I'd never heard of. Then he told me I had 3 days to bring him $15,000 in cash and leave it at that address. I almost said something sarcastic because the number was so absurd, but the way he said it, flat and certain, stopped me. He drove off before I could even process what had just happened. I didn't have $15,000. I don't have anywhere close to $15,000. And I wasn't going to go anywhere near some unknown road in the middle of the night to deliver cash to a stranger who'd been stalking me. I wrote the address down anyway and stood there shaking behind the counter. I told myself it was a scam. I told myself someone was messing with me. I almost convinced myself. For nights passed. Nothing happened. No car. No notes. No broken windows. I started to breathe again, thinking maybe it was over, maybe whoever this was had moved on. I was wrong. I was home on my couch around 6:30 a.m., just unwinding after my shift, when I heard a sound like a crack of thunder directly inside my apartment. I threw myself off the couch onto the floor before I even understood what I was doing. My ears were ringing. When I finally looked up, I saw it. The window above my kitchen sink had been shattered inward. A chunk of concrete was sitting in my sink, surrounded by broken glass. I called the police immediately. They showed up, took a report, and I told them everything. The drive-through visits, the note, the demand, the address. They said they'd send someone to check out the location, and they'd increase patrols near my building. What they didn't say was that they could actually do anything. Without camera footage of the vehicle or the individual, the officer told me, there isn't much to go on. That was 5 days ago. I've called in sick every night since. I haven't been able to sleep more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. I've been staying at a friend's place, but I haven't told him why. I keep thinking about the credit card. The guy paid with a card 3 separate times. There has to be a record of it. I'm going to push the police on that this week. I don't know who this person is. I don't know what he thinks I did. I don't know what he wants beyond money I don't have. All I know is that someone's been watching me closely enough to learn my full name, find out where I live, and walk up to my door in the dark without being seen. And whatever this is, I don't think it's over. I finished my marketing degree about 9 months ago, and honestly, the job market has been a complete joke. Nobody told me that a diploma would basically just be an expensive piece of paper gathering dust on a shelf. I'm still crashing at my parents' place in a small town outside of Portland, Oregon, sending out applications that disappear into the void and never come back. In the meantime, I started delivering for DoorDash and doing rideshare on the side. My name is Ethan, by the way, 23 years old, no career, no apartment, and apparently no shortage of poor decision-making skills. As you're about to find out, I usually work Thursday through Sunday nights, somewhere between 8 p.m. and 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. The tips are better on weekends, and the demand picks up once the restaurants get busy and people start drinking. It's not glamorous, but it keeps gas in my tank and gives me a reason to get out of the house. My parents mean well, but 4 walls and parental concern can only take a person so far. This whole thing happened about 3 weeks ago on a Friday night. It was getting close to 1 a.m., and I was already mentally done for the night. I had one last delivery request sitting on my screen, and I almost swiped it away. The pickup was from a diner on the east side of town, which was fine, but the drop-off address was way out past the edge of the county, almost 45 minutes into a rural stretch of highway that connects our area to the next town over. The payout was unusually high, though high enough that I accepted it before my better judgment had a chance to weigh in. The delivery itself was completely uneventful. I handed off a paper bag to a tired-looking woman at the end of a long gravel driveway. She thanked me without making eye contact, and that was it. By the time I turned my car around and started heading back toward town, it was nearly 2 a.m., and I was completely alone on a two-lane highway surrounded by flat farmland and darkness. I'd been driving for maybe 12 or 13 minutes when I saw them. A pickup truck was parked diagonally across part of the road, with its hazard lights blinking orange into the dark. Two people were standing in the headlights, waving both arms over their heads. My stomach tightened immediately. Every instinct I had said to keep moving. But I've never been able to drive past someone who looks like they need help. It's a reflex I genuinely can't suppress, even when I probably should. I slowed down and stopped about 25 feet back. I cracked my window maybe 3 inches, just enough to hear, not enough for anyone to get a hand inside. It was a man and a woman, both probably in their late 50s. The woman stepped forward and started talking fast. She had this breathless, urgent quality, but something about the rhythm of her words felt slightly off, like she was reciting something she had practiced rather than reacting to something that had just happened. She said there was a washed-out section of road about a mile ahead where a drainage channel had overflowed earlier that evening and taken out a chunk of the asphalt. She said the drop was sudden, and in the dark, I'd never see it in time. She pointed down the road with one arm extended, finger aimed into blackness like she was showing me the edge of the world. The man spoke up next. He described a fire road that branched off the highway about half a mile ahead, just past an old grain silo I'd apparently recognized by its rusted roof. He said the road cut east through the fields and connected back to the state highway further up. It would add time, he said, but it was the only safe way through. I nodded and told them I appreciated the warning. Then I rolled my window back up and sat there for a second. Something was wrong. I couldn't name it. Couldn't point to any single thing they'd said or done. It was just a feeling, the kind that lives in your chest rather than your head. I made the decision right then to ignore their directions entirely and keep driving the way I'd originally been going. Sure enough, about half a mile up the road, I passed the old silo with a rusted roof, and there it was, the fire road. It was a single lane of packed dirt that cut off into the fields and vanished immediately into the darkness. No lights anywhere down it. No signs. Nothing. I kept driving. Another mile later, the road was completely fine. No washed-out section, no drop, no drainage damage of any kind. The asphalt was smooth and dry, and I crossed whatever they'd been warning me about, without even knowing where it was supposed to have been. I made it back to the highway in another 20 minutes and drove home without any more problems. But I couldn't let it go. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, running the encounter over and over my head. What would have happened if I had turned down that dirt road, alone, at 2 a.m., in the middle of fields with no houses nearby, and no cell signal worth mentioning out there? The question kept me up until sunrise. About a week later, I drove back out there in the middle of the afternoon. Broad daylight, familiar roads. The whole thing looked completely different with the sun on it. I retraced my route from that night and found the fire road easily enough. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. Something immediately caught my eye. There was a sign that hadn't been there before. Someone had hammered a wooden post into the soft dirt at the entrance of the road and nailed a painted board to it. White background, black letters. It said, "Private property," and "Oh, trespassing." That sign had not been there the night I drove past. I was certain of it. I would have noticed it even in the dark because my headlights would have picked up the reflective paint. Someone had put it up in the days between my first visit and this one. I sat on the hood of my car and looked down the road. In daylight, it was less threatening, but not exactly welcoming either. The dirt path ran straight for about 100 yards before curving out of sight behind a dense wall of tall grass and scrub brush. No buildings visible. No vehicles. Nothing. I decided to walk a little way down it, just far enough to see past the bend. I stepped off the asphalt, and the feeling hit me almost instantly. Standing at the entrance of that road in the open air felt completely different from sitting inside my car looking at it. The afternoon was quiet out there, genuinely quiet, no wind, no birds, no distant traffic. That kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like something holding its breath. I stopped walking. I was maybe 30 feet from the road, still well within inside my car, and I just stopped. I can't explain it better than to say that the air felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a space where the normal rules had been quietly suspended. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, and then I turned around. I was 3 steps from my car when I heard it. It came from somewhere deep down the road behind me, far past the bend where I couldn't see. A voice. A woman's voice. Not screaming exactly, but crying out, sharp and desperate, the kind of sound a person makes when they are truly frightened and need help. I don't remember making the decision to run. I was just suddenly in my car with the engine on and the wheels spinning on the gravel shoulder as I accelerated back onto the road. I didn't stop until I hit the gas station at the edge of town, 6 miles away. I sat in the parking lot with the car running, and my hands shaking on the steering wheel for a solid 5 minutes. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't gone back. I haven't reported it to anyone because I genuinely don't know what I would even say. I heard a sound in a field. A couple of strangers gave me bad directions in the middle of the night, but the sound I heard was real. Whatever was down that road, whatever those two people were trying to direct me toward that night, it was not a washout in the asphalt. I've been thinking about asking my roommate from college to drive out there with me. He's the kind of person who would actually do it. If we go, I'll bring a camera and post whatever we find. But right now, sitting here writing this out, I'm not entirely sure I want to know what's at the end of that road. Some answers might not be worth finding. This took place a few summers ago when I was pulling overnight shifts at a cold storage facility outside of a mid-sized industrial town in rural Montana. My name is Marcus. I was 29 at the time and had been working the job for just under a year after getting laid off from a logistics company. The hours ran from midnight to 8 a.m., and the expectation was simple. Keep the building secure, monitor the systems, walk the grounds every hour, and call management if something serious came up. Management, in this case, was a man named Gerald who lived 40 minutes away and who I had spoken on the phone exactly twice in 11 months. Most nights the job was profoundly boring. The facility stored refrigerated pharmaceutical supplies and temperature-sensitive food inventory for a regional distribution company. It sat at the end of a long access road flanked by empty fields, and once you drove past the gate, there was nothing around for miles in any direction. The nearest gas station was a 15-minute drive. I got used to the isolation pretty quickly. You had to. The night things went wrong started the same way every other night did. I clocked in, did my first exterior walk, checked the gate locks and the loading doors on the south side, and settled into the monitoring booth with a coffee and a book. The surveillance system covered 14 cameras total, 7 exterior and 7 interior, all feeding into a single panel of monitors mounted above the desk. Around 1:15 a.m., I got an alert from exterior camera 4, which covered the rear access lane along the east wall of the building. Motion alerts on that camera weren't unusual. Rabbits and foxes set it off regularly, and in the summer the motion detection was even more sensitive because of the heat rising off the asphalt. I pulled the feed up and watched for about 90 seconds. Nothing, just the empty lane and the pale wash of the floodlights and a few moths circling the bulb housing. I went back to my book. The alert came again at 1:40, then again at 2:05, then twice more before 2:30. Every single one from camera 4, and only camera 4. The other 13 cameras stayed silent all night. I watched each alert carefully, and each time I saw the same thing. An empty lane, still air, no animals, nothing I could point to. What started bothering me was something I couldn't quite articulate at first. On the third or fourth review, I noticed that whatever was triggering the sensor seemed to be happening just beyond the rightmost edge of the frame. Not in the camera's view, but close to it, like something was positioning itself deliberately just outside the range of the lens. At 2:45, I grabbed my flashlight and went out to check it myself. The summer night was warm and completely windless, which made the silence feel almost pressurized. I walked the full length of the east lane slowly, running the flashlight along the wall, across the loading door frames, and into the drainage ditch that ran parallel to the fence line. Nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt along the ditch. No damage to the fence. Every door handle I tested was locked and undisturbed. I stood at the far end of the lane for a moment and just listened. Nothing came back. I went inside and sat down and tried to convince myself it was a sensor malfunction. 25 minutes later, I heard it. It was a low mechanical grinding sound, the kind a heavy dolly or a pallet jack makes when it rolls across a concrete floor. It came from somewhere deep inside the facility, past the refrigerated bays, somewhere in the dry storage section at the far end of the building. I pulled up the interior cameras immediately. Aisle 1, clear. Aisle 2, clear. 3, 4, 5, all empty. The cold storage bay cameras showed nothing but rows of shrink-wrapped pallets and the faint mist of refrigerated air. I told myself it was the building settling. Old structures make noise. I turned back to my book and made it through maybe 4 pages before I heard again. This time it was louder and followed by something else. A low impact, solid and deliberate, like something hard being set down firmly on a concrete floor rather than dropped. Not an accident. A control placement. I went back to the camera panel, cycled through all 7 interior feeds, and then I got to interior camera 6, which covered the far end of the dry storage section. The image flickered. Maybe 2 or 3 seconds of disrupted signal, horizontal static rolling through the frame, and then it stabilized. But when it came back, the angle was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just subtly, unmistakably off, tilted a few degrees clockwise from where it had been, as if someone had reached up and rotated the housing slightly with their hand. I sat there and stared at it for a long moment. Then I picked up my radio and my flashlight, told myself to breathe, and went into the warehouse. The interior of the facility at night was a different world from what it was during the day. During operating hours, it was loud and bright, forklifts running constantly, workers calling across the aisles. At night, the overhead lights switched to a reduced setting that cast everything in a flat, pale amber glow. The shelving units were 12 feet tall, and the aisles between them were narrow enough that you could only see about 30 feet ahead before the shadows swallowed the rest. Sound carried strangely in there. You could hear your own footsteps echoing back from directions that didn't make sense. I moved down the main aisle toward the dry storage section. My flashlight beam felt inadequate against the scale of the space. I kept it moving, checking between shelving units as I passed each gap. I was maybe 60 feet from the far end when I heard footsteps. They came from my left, somewhere 2 or 3 rows over, pacing parallel to me, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belong to someone who knows the space and isn't concerned about being heard. The moment I stopped walking, they stopped too. Not a half-second delay, not an echo, simultaneous, as if whoever had been watching my feet rather than listening to my movement. I stood in the amber light and did not move and did not speak for what felt like an extremely long time. Then I called out. I used my firmest, most professional voice and announced that I was the on-site security officer, that I was aware someone was on the premises, and that the appropriate thing to do was to show themselves immediately and we could handle the situation calmly. The silence that came back was total. I finished the sweep of the entire storage section. Every aisle, every alcove, both emergency exit corridors, the space behind the receiving station at the back wall. I found nothing. No person, no open door, no window that had been tampered with, no indication of how anyone could have gotten inside. The longer I searched without finding anyone, the worse the feeling in my chest became, because I had heard those footsteps clearly enough that I was not willing to doubt them. Someone had been there, walking in time with me, and they had simply ceased to be findable. The rest of the shift passed without another sound. By the time Gerald showed up at 8 in the morning, I had written 4 pages of notes. He read them twice, then called the maintenance team to do a full inspection of the building. They checked every door, every window, the roof access hatches, the ventilation grates, the loading bay seals. They found nothing compromised. No signs of forced entry anywhere on the structure. Camera 6 was examined and the technician confirmed that the housing had been physically rotated but couldn't say how or by whom. Gerald thanked me for the detailed report and did not look like he believed a word of it. I worked that facility for another 4 months before I found something else. In all that time, nothing like it happened again. But I never fully stopped listening for those footsteps during the long, quiet hours between midnight and morning. Some nights I still think about that amber light and those narrow aisles and the sound of someone walking exactly in step with me, just out of sight, unhurried, as if they had nowhere else to be. I've never talked about this publicly before. A few close friends know part of it, and I gave a statement to the police at the time, but I've never sat down and written the whole thing out until now. It still gets to me in a way that nothing else ever has. About 4 years ago, I was working the overnight shift at a small indoor climbing and fitness center in a quiet suburb outside of Edinburgh, Scotland. My name is Ryan. I was 19, taking time off before university, and the job was straightforward enough that I didn't think twice about the hours. The place operated around the clock, and members accessed the building using a digital fob attached to their membership account. Every entry, every exit, every piece of equipment used was logged automatically in the system. My role was essentially to sit in the staff room, watch the monitors, do light cleaning between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. when traffic was lowest, and handle anything unusual that came up. Management trusted the technology more than they trusted human judgment, which turned out to be a problem. The facility sat in a mixed-use area that had seen better decades. The surrounding streets weren't dangerous exactly, but they weren't comfortable either. Most of the late-night regulars were shift workers, insomniacs, and an occasional person who just preferred to exercise when the place was empty. After a few months, I knew most of them by name, or at least by face. This particular night, I was covering 9 p.m. through 6 a.m. By 2:30 in the morning, I had finished my cleaning rounds, updated the incident log, and settled back into the chair in front of the monitor bank. The building was quiet. 2 members had checked out around midnight, and nobody had come in since. I assumed I was alone in the building and was halfway through a podcast when something on one of the screens made me sit forward. There was a man on the rowing machine in the far corner of the main floor. I hadn't seen him come in. I hadn't heard the door. His fob entry should have triggered a notification on my screen, and I didn't remember seeing one. I pulled up the entry log and scrolled back through the last 2 hours. His name wasn't there. There was no record of anyone checking in after 11:47 p.m. I told myself I must have missed it. The system occasionally lagged. I looked back at the screen and watched him. He was rowing at a pace that immediately struck me as wrong. Not wrong in the sense of bad technique, but wrong in the sense that it was relentless, steady, mechanical, and absolutely unbroken. I pulled up the equipment monitoring interface and found his machine. The stroke rate was sitting at 42 strokes per minute, which is an elite competitive pace, and it had apparently been holding there since before I noticed him. I watched the counter. A minute passed. 2 minutes. 5. He did not slow. He did not pause. He did not shift in the seat or reach for a water bottle or look around. I switched to the closest interior camera and zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. He was wearing dark clothing that looked like it had been slept in for several nights. His hair was tangled and hanging forward around his face. What I could see of his expression was completely blank. Not the focused blankness of an athlete in a rhythm, but something emptier than that. His eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance that didn't correspond to anything on the wall in front of him. His mouth was slightly open. Then I noticed his hands. He wasn't using the handle grips the way anyone normally would. His fingers were wrapped around the bar in a way that looked more like clenching than holding. Knuckles visibly pale even through the low-resolution feed, and his feet were not in the foot straps. They were planted flat against the foot plates with nothing securing them, which shouldn't have been mechanically possible at that stroke rate. I watched him for another 4 minutes without moving from my chair. He had been at that pace for somewhere close to 20 minutes without a single break. We had a policy about proper equipment use and membership verification. I told myself that was my reason for going out there. I got up, took my radio from the desk, and walked out of the staff room into the main floor. The ceiling lights in the main area ran at 60% after midnight. The room was lit but shadowed, the equipment arranged in long rows that created channels of dim light between them. The rowing machine was at the far end near the climbing wall. I could hear him before I could see him clearly. The mechanical rhythm of the machine, the slide of the seat, the catch and drive, over and over, perfectly metered. I came around the last row of equipment and stopped. The footplates beneath his feet were dark and wet. It took my eyes a moment to understand what I was seeing because the lighting was poor and my brain was slow to accept it. The floor around the base of the machine was stained in a wide arc. His feet were bare and had been bare the entire time, and the skin on his heels and the balls of his feet had been worn through completely. He was rowing through it without any visible acknowledgement of pain. His face hadn't changed. Open mouth, fixed stare, stroke after stroke after stroke. I think I said his name, though I didn't know his name. I think I just made a sound. He didn't react. I called out clearly, told him he needed to stop, that I was a facility attendant, and he needed to stop the machine immediately. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He kept rowing. And then, without turning his head or changing his expression, he said something. His voice was low and rough and completely without effort. No breathlessness at all for someone at that exertion level. He said, "Can you see me?" I told him again to stop. He said it again. "Can you see me?" I stepped back and told him I was calling emergency services. He said nothing further. I walked back to the staff room as quickly as I could without running, picked up the phone, and dialed. As I was giving the address to the operator, I glanced at the monitors out of habit. He was looking directly at the camera. Not at the wall where the camera was mounted, not in the general direction of it, at the lens itself, rowing at the same pace, feet leaving marks on the floor with every stroke, mouth open, staring straight into the camera with an expression that I am genuinely unable to describe accurately. Then he screamed. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a response to anything. It was just a sustained, full-volume scream that I could hear clearly from inside the staff room with the door closed. The operator on the phone asked me what that sound was, and I couldn't answer. I watched him on the monitor as he kept screaming, still rowing, still staring at the camera. Then he stopped rowing and stood up. He didn't stumble. He didn't look down at his feet. He just stood and walked off the frame of the camera at a pace that was too calm for everything else about the situation. I cycled through every camera feed as fast as I could. Main floor, clear. Stretching area, clear. Changing rooms corridor, clear. Climbing wall area, clear. The last camera I checked was the staff corridor, the hallway that ran directly to the door I was standing behind. He was in it, standing in the middle of the frame about 8 feet from the staff room door, perfectly still, staring toward the camera. I have no explanation for how he accessed that corridor. The door at the far end required a staff key card, and there was no record of it being opened. I locked the staff room door. The handle moved 4 seconds later. Not rattled, not forced, just turned slowly, all the way, testing the lock with a patience that was somehow worse than aggression would have been. I backed into the corner of the room and kept the phone to my ear and told the operator the situation. She told me police were 6 minutes away and to stay on the line. He started screaming again from the other side of the door. It was unlike anything I had heard before. Too low to sound entirely human, with a sustained quality that didn't seem to require breath in the way a normal voice would. It went on and on while I sat in the corner of that room with my back against the wall, certain that if the lock gave way I was going to be seriously hurt. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then it stopped. I did not move. I did not check the cameras. I sat in that corner until I heard knocking and a voice identifying itself as police, and even then I didn't open the door until I heard the second officer confirm the same thing from outside. They searched the entire building. Every room, every corridor, the storage areas, the roof access stairwell, both emergency exits. He was gone. The blood was still on the floor, and the footplate and the equipment monitoring system still had his session logged, the only record that he had ever been there. The entry log still showed no registered check-in. The police took my statement, took photographs of the machine, and told me someone would follow up. Nobody ever did, as far as I know. I handed in my notice the following morning by text message and never went back to collect my things. I don't know who he was or what he wanted or how he got into that corridor. I don't know how he walked on those feet or how he screamed that way or why he disappeared the moment the police arrived. What I do know is that I think about the moment he looked directly into that camera lens, and I wonder whether locking that door was the only thing that mattered that night, and whether he let me lock it on purpose.
Let me say up front that the number of stories like this, one coming out of the interior of British Columbia, doesn't surprise me at all. And I think there are 2 clear reasons for it. The first is the sheer density of wilderness pressing right up against populated areas. You can walk 20 minutes from a Tim Hortons and be in terrain that hasn't seen a human footprint in months. The second is the particular culture of the region, where a significant percentage of residents spend their leisure time genuinely deep in the backcountry, hiking, hunting, fishing, trapping, and doing the kind of things that put you in places where unusual encounters become statistically more likely. This story belongs to two men I'll call Bryn and Soren, both old friends of mine from the years I spent living near the small community of Harrow Creek, tucked into a river valley in the southern interior of BC, roughly an hour's drive east of the city of Kamloops. Don't let the word community conjure anything too settled. Harrow Creek at the time had a general store, a gas station, a small Legion Hall, and maybe 200 people scattered across a radius of several kilometers, most of them on acreage that backed directly into crown land stretching unbroken toward the mountain ridges. We all used to spend time on and around a large private property called the Kettle Run. Thousands of acres of mixed terrain, including old-growth Douglas fir, shale slopes, creek drainage channels, and the kind of exposed granite ridgelines that make you feel very small and very visible at the same time. The wildlife pressure out there was real and constant. We spoke with a conservation officer once who told us the cougar density in that drainage was among the highest recorded in the province. We regularly saw tracks: cat, bear, coyote, wolverine. We once found the remains of a deer kill that had been dragged up a vertical rock face, which the CO confirmed was consistent with a large cougar caching its food. There were also confirmed wolf pack sightings within a 20-kilometer radius, and in the summers, we would sometimes hear them at night, that carrying multi-toned chorus that sounds nothing like anything else. The wilderness around Harrow Creek was not decorative. It had weight to it. From Bryn's account, it was late on a September night when Soren and I decided to walk up the creek drainage from the main road to the Kettle Run to drop in unannounced on our friend Dale, who was staying in the old cabin up there for a few weeks. We got up there and discovered Dale had turned in early. He and his girlfriend were both already asleep and clearly not thrilled to be roused. We felt appropriately foolish, made our apologies, and started back down the drainage toward the road. Instead of retracing our route along the creek bank, we decided to cut across through the lower ridgeback section, a rocky shelf of terrain that runs parallel to the drainage and provides a more direct line. We had no flashlights. It was one of those decisions that seems reasonable when you make it and inexplicable in retrospect. The moon was up and casting enough pale light to navigate by barely. The air was cold and completely still. I remember the silence being the first thing that registered as unusual, not peaceful quiet, but the specific absence of insect and bird sound that in that kind of terrain typically signals something larger is present and everything else knows it. I mentioned to Soren that there was probably a cat working the area, maybe a bear. We kept moving. The wildlife out there generally wants nothing to do with humans, and the advice we'd always been given was to make noise and keep moving. Then we heard the sound. It came from somewhere up the slope to our left, in the dark beneath the tree-line. A sequence of cracking and snapping sounds. Not the dry crack of a branch underfoot, but something heavier and more organic, like the sound of joints under pressure. Dense and wet. I stopped walking. Soren stopped beside me. I convinced myself it was a cougar with a kill. They make unsettling sounds when they're feeding, pulling apart a carcass, and in still air the acoustics in those creek drainages carry and distort. We kept moving. We were maybe 50 yards into the ridgeback section, picking our way between boulder formations, debating whether to go left or right around a cluster of standing rock, when I saw them. 2 points of pale yellowish light, down in the gully to our left, perhaps 100 meters distant. My first thought was headlamps, other hikers, unlikely as that seemed at that hour in that location. My second thought was eyes, animal eyes catching the moonlight, and I was running through the inventory of what might be moving down there when the sound hit us. I don't have a good word for it. It was low and resonant and seemed to come from inside my chest as much as from any external direction. Not a scream, not a growl, more like a sustained exhalation of force, something that occupied the lower registers of sound and the upper registers of feeling at the same time. I felt it in my back teeth. I stood completely still for what was probably 3 seconds and felt, with total clarity, that I did not want to be where I was. Soren grabbed the back of my jacket and pulled me right, away from the gully, into the rockier terrain around the far side of the standing stones. "What was that?" I said. My voice was not steady. "I don't know. We need a fire. Right now." Soren was already moving when he said it, pulling dry material together from the ground: dead grass, loose bark, brittle sticks snapped from the lower branches of a dead pine. I started gathering anything larger I could lay hands on. Soren had a lighter, and he worked a small pile with the focused urgency of someone who has understood in a physical way that this matters. I was feeding larger sticks onto the growing pile and looking back over my shoulder into the dark. Something was moving in my peripheral vision, or I thought it was. The moonlight creates shapes in terrain like that, and I wasn't certain enough of what I was seeing to say anything. The fire took. Soren built it up fast, adding fuel in a deliberate way, and within a few minutes we had actual flame, throwing real light into the surrounding space. The smell came with it, or just before it. I noticed it first as something familiar and wrong, a thick biological smell like something long dead in warm weather, with an underlying musk that reminded me of wet dog but heavier and stranger. I didn't say anything. Soren looked at me. I could tell he'd caught it too. I was feeding branches into the fire when I turned around and saw it, 25 meters out, maybe less, at the edge of the firelight, where definition blurs into suggestion. 2 eyes, the same pale yellow I had seen in the gully, but now, and this is the part that lodged in me and has stayed there elevated. I am 6 feet tall. I held a burning branch up to shoulder height, and those eyes were still above mine. Whatever they belonged to was standing upright, and it was large, not bare large in the familiar, lumbering sense I had encountered before. Something different. It wasn't moving. It was watching. And I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it's easy to project, easy to impose a narrative on a pair of eyes in the dark. But what I registered in that moment was attention, not the diffuse animal alertness of prey assessing threat. Something that felt directed and considered. I felt, with a certainty I cannot justify clinically, that whatever was behind those eyes was making a decision. Soren said, very quietly, "Behind us." A second pair of eyes, further back, at the opposite edge of the light. Both sets began to move, slowly, laterally, tracing the perimeter of the firelight in the same direction, counterclockwise, methodical. Soren was building the fire higher, throwing everything available onto it, and I was moving in the opposite arc, keeping the flame between myself and the nearer set of eyes. The fire was large enough now that I was half concerned about the surrounding dry undergrowth, which struck me as a darkly absurd secondary problem given the circumstances. The sound came again, the resonant, low exhalation of force, closer this time. Close enough that I felt it displace the air in my lungs slightly. Then a different sound, something I can only describe as a deep, rhythmic huffing, like large bellows working. Then silence again. Then the eyes were gone. Both pairs, simultaneously, as though withdrawn by agreement. We heard footsteps, 2-footed, heavy, unhurried, moving away uphill, fading into the creak and shift of the forest, until there was nothing. We kept that fire burning until the sky began to pale in the east. At some point we both apparently fell asleep sitting up. When full light came, we doused the fire thoroughly, looked at each other without saying much, and walked directly down to the road. My truck had been visited by a bear at some point during the night. I'd left fishing gear in the cab, and the door had been efficiently defeated. We drove to Kamloops, and neither of us spoke for most of the way. Soren's addition. After that night, we spent some time trying to find a framework for what we'd encountered. This was before every unusual outdoor experience had its own dedicated subreddit and documentary series. So the research was slower and less structured. The term that kept appearing in what we found was one I hadn't encountered before. The description that came with it didn't match what we had seen in any clean or satisfying way. The cultural image attached to the name felt cartoonish compared to whatever had moved around the edge of our fire. What we encountered was not cartoonish. It was a predator, or 2 predators, operating in coordinated fashion, demonstrating patience, demonstrating what looked like strategic behavior. and demonstrating no apparent fear of us or our fire beyond a decision not to close the remaining distance. I want to be honest about the limits of what we actually observed. We saw eyes and heard sounds and smelled something foul and felt something that registered in the body as a warning. We did not see a body, a face, a hand, or a clear silhouette. It is possible, I suppose, that what we encountered was two very large bears behaving in an atypical manner. But no bear I have ever seen or heard or read about behaved the way those things behaved that night. And the elevation of those eyes above the ground was not consistent with a bear on all fours, and the sound of the bipedal departure was not consistent with a bear at all. I've been back into the Harrow Creek drainage many times since. I go armed and I go with at least one other person, and I stay on the main trail after dark. The backcountry around that valley is extraordinary, and I'm not willing to cede it to whatever is out there. But I notice that I am more careful than I used to be about which draws I enter, and about standing still in exposed terrain after the light drops. And whenever I catch a smell I don't recognize, something with that dense biological wrongness underneath it, I start building a fire immediately. Some lessons embed themselves in a way that no amount of subsequent rationalization can fully dislodge. That night on the Ridgeback is one of them. The Harrow Creek Valley has a well-documented record of missing persons, cases going back decades. Hikers, hunters, people who knew the terrain well and simply didn't come back. There's always an official explanation. There usually is. But the country up there is vast, and the things living in it are not all cataloged. And I think about those missing persons records more than I used to. I think about them especially when I'm deep in the drainage, and the birds stop making noise, and the air goes still and heavy in that particular way. That means something nearby has made a decision to be very quiet. People tell me I sound dramatic when I say I'm haunted. I understand why it sounds that way, but spend one night inside what I walked into, and then come back and tell me dramatic is the wrong word. I dare you. Our county sat in the low flatlands of southern Georgia, the kind of place where the roads go straight for miles between fields of cotton and pine, where the water tower is the tallest structure for 30 kilometers in any direction, and where the most significant criminal matter in a given month was likely to involve an unlicensed vehicle or a dispute over a property line. We were not naive about the world. We just had no reason to expect the world would bring its worst to us. I was relatively new to the department when it happened, 18 months in, still carrying the particular alertness of someone who hasn't yet settled into routine. It was a Tuesday night in late summer, the air thick, and wet the way it gets down there in August, when my radio broke the silence just after 2 in the morning. Dispatch. A woman named Vera, who had been with the department longer than anyone, was on the line. Her voice had a quality I had never heard from her before. Controlled, but barely. Reports of screaming coming from the Hargrove property. She said, "Edge of the county." Caller declined to be identified. I want to be clear. The Hargroves were a well-regarded family. Been in that county for 3 generations. Quiet people, kept to themselves, but were always friendly when you crossed paths. No history with our office. Hearing their name attached to a disturbance, call sat wrong with me from the first second. I told Vera I was en route and drove out. The property was about 25 minutes from town down a 2-lane road that cut through pine plantation and then open farmland. I remember the drive clearly. The way my headlights made a pale tunnel through the dark. The way the kazoo on the fence lines looked silver in the beams. I remember trying to construct reasonable explanations. A domestic argument that escalated. An injury. Something medical. Something explainable. I pulled through the gate and immediately registered that something was wrong without being able to name specifically what. It took me a moment to identify it. The silence. Not the ordinary silence of a rural property at night, which always has texture to it. Insects, frogs, whatever's moving in the fields. This silence was flat and absolute. Nothing was making any sound at all. Not a cricket, not a breeze through the pines. The house sat in front of me dark except for a single porch light that was flickering intermittently, and the shadows it threw across the yard looked wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. I got out, drew my flashlight. The heat hadn't broken with the night, and the air was still heavy and close, but I felt cold. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and the smell came out at me immediately. Something metallic, and beneath that something else, organic and wrong. The smell of matter that has no business being exposed to air. I have smelled blood before. This was more than blood. I pulled breath through my mouth and moved inside. The flashlight beam moved across the entry hall. Dark sprays and streaks across the walls at heights that made no sense until they made terrible sense. I moved toward the living room the way you move when every instinct you have is screaming at you to go the other direction, and your training is the only thing still pointing you forward. The floorboards announced each step. The house felt like it was listening to me. What I found in the living room I will not describe in clinical detail, because I've made a decision over the years that I don't owe anyone that. What I will say is that the Hargrove family, parents and 2 grown children, people I had spoken to at the county fair 2 summers before, were gone in every meaningful sense while still being present in the room. What had been done to them required a sustained, deliberate attention to the act of causing suffering that I had no framework for and have never fully developed one since. They were unrecognizable. Their expressions were, I don't have the word. Frozen mid-scream is the closest I can come. For people who had done nothing wrong, whose only apparent offense was existing in a county that something monstrous had chosen to pass through. I made it back outside before I was sick. I crouched in the yard and stayed there for longer than I should have, which meant I was outside and exposed, which is a thing I would understand the significance of only later. When I had recovered enough to function, I got back on the radio with Vera. I kept my voice flat and factual because that was the only way I was going to keep moving. I described the scene. I described the nature of what had been done. In the clinical language you learn in training that exists specifically to create distance between yourself and the content of the words. Vera was silent for a beat longer than she should have been, and then she told me she was sending backup and to hold the perimeter. I had told her one other thing. On the inner door frame of the entry hall, at shoulder height, there was a mark, carved into the wood, recently, with something sharp. I had seen that mark once before in a file that circulated through the department the previous year, a document shared by a state agency as a broad awareness notice. It was associated with a trafficking network operating out of the Gulf Coast corridor that had, in that document, been described as expanding its footprint northward into rural areas. I had read the file, noted it, filed it away as information relevant to somewhere else. It was no longer relevant to somewhere else. I stood in that yard with the porch light still flickering behind me, and I thought about the kind of organization that does what had been done inside the house as a message, as a statement. I thought about the 18 months I had been a deputy in a county department of 11 officers total, with no tactical unit, no organized crime experience, and equipment that was borderline adequate for traffic enforcement. I thought about what it would mean if this was a beginning rather than an isolated incident. The night felt very large around me. Then the thought arrived that I should have arrived sooner and didn't. And when it did, the temperature of my fear dropped about 10 degrees. The screaming, the initial call, the caller who declined to be identified. I stood still in the yard and ran the geography in my head. The Hargrove property sat at the end of a private track off a road that saw almost no traffic. The nearest neighboring structure was over 1.5 kilometers away in poor sight lines. For anyone to have heard screaming from this location and been close enough to identify it as coming from this specific property, they would have had to be here, on the land, in proximity to the house, which meant the anonymous caller had been present, which meant someone had watched what happened inside, or participated in what happened inside, and then placed a call directing law enforcement to the scene. And I was alone in that yard, in the dark, with a flickering light throwing inadequate illumination across terrain I hadn't checked and couldn't see to the edges of. I turned toward my cruiser. My legs felt wrong, like the signals from my brain were arriving slightly delayed. The cruiser was parked 20 meters from me, just inside the gate. I focused on it and started moving and kept my light sweeping the perimeter as I went. I was telling myself to keep it measured, not to run. Running meant something was chasing you, and nothing was chasing me, and I needed to reach the vehicle and lock the door and wait for backup from inside it. I reached the cruiser, put my hand on the door handle, looked up. The rear windows, both of them, handprints, pressed in what I did not need to examine closely to identify. Small, distinct, the full spread of fingers visible, multiple prints overlapping, as though someone had stood there for a period of time with their hands against the glass, looking in. While I was inside the house, I got in the vehicle, locked it, did not take my eyes off the darkness beyond the headlights until the first backup unit came through the gate 40 minutes later. I spoke to no one during those 40 minutes. I kept my hands on the wheel and breathed and watched the dark and waited. I left the department 9 months after that night. The case went to state investigators and from there to federal agencies, and I was thanked for my initial response and told that I had handled it correctly and that I should let the relevant bodies do what they were trained to do. I was told this several times by several different people. I believe they meant it, but nobody could close the door on what I had seen. Nobody could explain the handprints or the collar or what exactly I had been standing outside alone in the dark in proximity to while I waited in that yard. The state investigation produced several arrests over the following 2 years, none of which I was directly involved in, and none of which answered the specific questions I carry. I'm older now. I have a farm. I sleep adequately. I don't tell the story often, and when I do, I watch people decide how much of it to believe, which is their right. What I know is what I saw and what I felt in that yard, the specific quality of the certainty that came over me when I understood what the anonymous call meant and what it implied about where the caller had been. That certainty has never softened. Some knowledge is like that. Once it's in you, it doesn't leave. It just becomes part of the furniture of your interior life, something you arrange yourself around. The handprints are still the part that comes back at night. The thought that while I was inside that house moving through what I found in that living room, something was outside at my vehicle with its hands against the glass, watching the door I would eventually come back out of, patient, unhurried, fully aware of where I was and what I was doing and content to wait. I don't know who made that call. I don't know what they wanted me to find or what they intended to happen when I found it. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was something else. I've been asked that question more times than I can count, and the honest answer is the same every time. I don't know. I genuinely do not know. And after enough years of not knowing, you stop expecting the answer to arrive and start learning to carry the question instead. That's the job I do now, carrying it every day. Some days it's lighter than others. Most days it isn't. I was 19 in 2003 when my friends and I made the worst decision of our lives. We drove out to Widow's Crossing, a narrow wooden bridge on the far edge of Millhaven, Oregon, on the last night of October. We thought the story was nothing more than regional folklore, the sort of tale that small towns invent to give themselves character, something to pass around at dinner tables and whisper at school dances until it becomes inseparable from the town's identity. Every person in Millhaven knew about Widow's Crossing, but not one of the people in my circle had ever actually gone there at midnight on Halloween to put the legend to the test. We were young and restless and firmly convinced that fear was something that happened to people less rational than us. We were spectacularly mistaken on every count. The legend itself was old and worn smooth from years of retelling, the way a stone gets smooth from a river. Sometime in the late 1880s, according to the story, a settler woman named Hester had walked to the bridge in the dead of winter and dropped her newborn into the freezing creek below. The circumstances changed depending on the teller. Some said her husband had abandoned her and she could not face raising a child alone in the wilderness. Others insisted she had lost her mind after a fever swept through her homestead and killed everyone she loved. A few versions claimed the child had never been hers at all, that she was a midwife who had done something unspeakable to a baby she was meant to protect. The details were always slightly different, but the center of the story held firm. A woman, a bridge, a child taken by the current, and a grief that curdled over time into something that refused to rest. If you stood on the bridge at midnight and whispered the words into the dark, the legend said, the sound of an infant crying would rise from the water below. Some who had gone there reported seeing a shadow figure moving along the far bank, too tall to be natural, too deliberate to be wind. Others spoke of frost appearing on their windshields, shaped like the spread of small fingers, even on warm autumn nights. Most educated people in Millhaven dismissed the whole thing as superstition dressed up as history. But enough older residents grew quiet when the bridge came up in conversation. Enough of them chose longer routes home rather than cross widows crossing after sundown, that the place had acquired a gravity you could feel even before you arrived. There were 5 of us that night, me and my closest friend, a red-haired girl named Caroline, plus 3 others from our community college. We told our families we were attending a costume party at a rental hall downtown, which was true enough, except that we had scheduled an earlier detour none of them knew about. We loaded into a single van around 10:30, buzzing with nervous energy, trying to outdo each other with increasingly dramatic versions of the widow's crossing story we had each collected over the years. Caroline sat in the front passenger seat and barely spoke the whole drive out. She kept turning her silver bracelet around and around her wrist, a habit she had when something was bothering her. When I leaned forward and asked if she was all right, she said she was fine, but the flatness in her voice told me she was not. The bridge sat about 20 minutes outside of town, reached by a progression of roads that narrowed from paved highway to cracked asphalt to gravel to something that barely deserved to be called a road at all. The last stretch cut through a belt of old-growth Douglas fir, and the canopy closed over us so completely that even our headlights seemed to bend and weaken in the dark. Widow's Crossing itself was a structure that looked like it had survived longer than it had any right to. The planks were weathered gray, the railings thin iron that had oxidized to a deep reddish brown. The creek beneath it was narrow enough to throw a stone across, but deep and fast-moving, cutting between mossy boulders in a channel that looked black as oil at night. We pulled the van off the road into a muddy gap between trees about 40 meters from the bridge and climbed out into the cold. October in Western Oregon carries a wet chill that gets into your joints, and we were all underdressed, costumes layered over insufficient sweaters, breath already clouding in the air. The plan was simple to the point of stupidity. Walk to the bridge, wait until midnight, recite the traditional words, and listen. If nothing came back to us, we would drive to the party and have a story to tell. If something responded, well, that would be worth the cold and the mud and the long drive out. The walk to the bridge should have taken 2 minutes. It felt like it took 20. The tree line on either side of the track seemed to lean inward as we moved, the darkness between the trunks so deep it looked solid. We made noise, jokes, and commentary, and theatrical, gasping at imagined sounds, but it all rang false against the quiet of the woods. Caroline walked directly beside me, her arm pressed against mine. I could feel how tightly she was holding herself together. We reached the bridge at 11:51. Someone pulled out a phone and confirmed the time, and we spread out along the railing to wait, sharing a thermos of hot chocolate that had already gone tepid. The planks under our feet felt uncertain, flexing slightly in ways that reminded you they were very old. Below, the creek moved fast and cold, catching what little moonlight filtered through the cloud cover and breaking it into shifting pieces. As midnight came closer, the talking tapered off on its own, not because anyone decided to stop, but because the air itself seemed to press against sound and muffle it. The forest had grown completely silent. No owls, no frogs, none of the usual texture of a night in the Pacific Northwest. Just the water below and the breathing of 5 people who were beginning to understand they might have made a miscalculation. One of our group suggested we leave. 2 others immediately told her to stop being dramatic. Nobody moved. When midnight came, I stepped forward without planning to. Some current in me that bypassed thought entirely. I walked to the midpoint of the bridge and turned to face the dark stretch of creek upstream, where the water curved out of sight beneath the trees. My friends arranged themselves behind me. I breathed in cold air that tasted like pine and wet stone and something else I could not identify, something older and darker beneath the familiar scents. Then I spoke the words into the dark. "Come back. I'm sorry." My voice dropped into the silence and vanished immediately, as if the night absorbed it. Nothing. Just the creek and the wind and the distant shifting of branches. Someone behind me exhaled loudly. I said the words again, louder, projecting them out over the water like a challenge. "Come back. I'm sorry." The sound came from below. Low at first, something you could almost convince yourself was the water moving over a particular configuration of rocks. But it rose, unmistakably, into the wailing of an infant, high and raw and desperate, bouncing off the underside of the bridge and the water surface and the boulders on either bank. It was not ambiguous. It was not wind. Every person on that bridge heard the same thing and knew exactly what it sounded like. Caroline was beside me in an instant. Her hand found my arm and locked around it. She was trembling, not from the cold. The crying continued, swelling and retreating in waves, and its source seemed to shift, sometimes from directly below us, sometimes from further up the creek, sometimes from the dark bank to our left. It moved the way something living moves, not the way a recorded sound repeats. Then Caroline did something I could not stop. She pulled out her phone, activated the torch, and leaned over the iron railing to point the beam down into the water. I grabbed for her shoulder, told her not to, but she had already committed. The white light cut down through the dark and illuminated the creek below, the black water, the pale boulders, the ribbons of current. She screamed. The sound she made was unlike anything I had heard from her in the 3 years I had known her. Not surprise, not fear exactly, but something beneath both of those, something foundational giving way. She reeled back from the railing, and her phone spun out of her grip and hit the water below with a sharp crack that echoed under the bridge. She pressed herself against me and said, in a voice that barely sounded like hers, that there was a face in the water, looking up, just below the surface, a white oval with dark hollows where the eyes should have been, and a mouth open in the same cry that was still coming up from below. The crying tripled in volume. It surrounded us now, not rising from the creek alone, but from the tree-line on both sides, from the air above us, from the grain of the bridge planks under our feet. And then we saw her. She was standing at the far end of the bridge, the Millhaven side, between us and the van, still as a carved figure, facing us directly, wearing something pale that might have been a dress or might have been a coat, glowing faintly against the dark tree wall behind her. She was tall, taller than any person had a right to be. Her hair was loose and dark and hung forward over her face, so that we could not see it. Only a featureless pale oval beneath the curtain of hair, where her face would be. We did not discuss leaving. There was no conversation. All 5 of us broke at the same moment, pure animal reaction overriding everything else. I pulled Caroline with me, because my hand was already on her arm. We ran back along the track toward the van, stumbling on the ruts, the mud grabbing at our feet. Behind us I could hear footsteps on the wooden planks, light and quick and not matching any rhythm a walking person would make. I did not turn. Turning seemed like it would complete something that I did not want to complete. Caroline ran without looking back, without asking me anything, just running and breathing in sharp, ragged bursts. We hit the van, and I went for the door, and my hands were shaking badly enough that I missed the handle twice. When I finally wrenched the door open and got the key into the ignition, the engine stuttered. Caught and died. Caught and died. I could hear the others reaching the van, piling in. Someone slamming a sliding door so hard the whole vehicle shook. I could hear footsteps in the mud outside, getting closer. Caroline had her eyes squeezed shut and was repeating something under her breath. Not words exactly, just sound. Like she was trying to fill her own head with something to drown out what was outside it. I turned the key one more time. The engine took. I reversed out of the gap, so fast we clipped a low branch and lost a side mirror. The headlights swung across the road, across the mud, across the entrance to the track leading to the bridge. She was there, on the road, between us and the highway. She had covered the distance from the bridge to where we had parked in the time it had taken me to get the van started, and now she was moving toward us with a speed that did not belong to anything human, her pale dress streaming behind her, her dark hair flying, not running the way people run, something faster and stranger, like the distance between her and us was a matter of her choosing rather than effort. I put the van in drive and went. The headlights washed over her for a fraction of a second, close enough that I flinched away from the windshield, and then she was behind us and the road was opening up, and I drove, without stopping, for 5 miles, until the trees thinned and the highway appeared, and the orange glow of a gas station sign materialized ahead like a signal from another world. I pulled in under the lights and sat there with the engine running and my hand still locked on the wheel. Nobody spoke for a long time. One of our group, a guy named Theo, had a long scratch along his jaw from a branch. Another, a woman named Priya, had lost a shoe somewhere on the track and did not seem to know it yet. Caroline sat with her knees drawn up to her chest in the passenger seat, staring at nothing. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were red and her face was so white the freckles across her nose stood out like ink. She asked if I had seen it. I said yes. We drove to the Millhaven police station. Not the party, not home, not anywhere that felt normal. The station. We needed walls and lights and other people around us. The officers on duty heard us out with the careful, patient expressions of people who had sat through this same conversation before, many times, on many Halloweens. They took notes. They were kind but unmistakably skeptical. The younger deputy suggested we had probably spooked ourselves and each other, that the acoustics under old bridges could produce strange sounds, that shadows and expectation could make a still shape in the dark look like it was moving. His older partner, a lean woman named Sergeant Vance with gray braids and a quiet manner, waited until the others were putting on their coats before she pulled me aside by the door. She told me that Widow's Crossing had appeared in their incident reports going back further than she had been on the force. Drivers who had swerved into ditches, claiming to avoid a figure in the road. A kayaker who had abandoned his gear and climbed out of the creek in winter because he said something in the water had looked back at him. A man who drove 30 miles to report that his engine had died on the bridge and something had walked slowly around his car 3 times before he finally managed to restart it and flee. She said the department had never found an explanation that fully satisfied them. She said the legend of Hester was probably a story people had built around something that was already there before any settler arrived to name it. She said whatever was at Widow's Crossing did not need permission from our belief to exist. She said not to go back. Not in daylight. Not in any season. Not ever. I am 39 years old now. I have kept that promise without difficulty. I left Millhaven for graduate school the following year and eventually settled in Portland, where I have lived for over a decade. I return to see family several times a year, and there's one stretch of road on the route where the highway passes within a kilometer of the turnoff for Widow's Crossing. I know exactly where it is. I always grip the steering wheel a little tighter at that point and look straight ahead with a deliberateness that is itself a kind of acknowledgement, because you cannot deliberately not look at something without knowing precisely what you are not looking at. Caroline and I stayed close for a few years after, but she eventually moved to the coast, and our contact faded to the occasional message on birthdays or holidays. We have never, in all the years since that night, discussed what happened at the bridge. It exists between us as a kind of shared scar, something we both carry but neither of us has ever wanted to press on. I think we both understand that talking about it would make it more present, and neither of us wants that. I have read everything I can find about Widow's Crossing over the years. The way you can't stop touching a bruise. The sources are scattered and inconsistent. The name Hester appears in some accounts, and not others. Some versions of the legend say the child was a girl, others a boy. Historical records from the county show a death recorded near the creek in 1891, but the details are incomplete and disputed. Reports of experiences at the bridge go back through newspaper archives to at least the 1940s, and the language in those old accounts is different from the modern versions, but the substance is recognizable. People heard a child crying from the water. People saw a pale figure at the bridge's edge. People drove away fast and did not go back. I do not know what we encountered that night. I do not know if the word ghost belongs to it, or if that word is just a label we use for things that exceed our categories. I do not know if the crying was genuinely a child or something else using that frequency, because it knows what it does to human nervous systems. I do not know if the woman we saw was the echo of a real woman or something that had simply discovered that shape was effective. What I know, what I will not argue about, what is not a matter of interpretation, is that 5 people experienced the same sequence of events that night. 5 people heard the same sounds and saw the same figure and ran from the same presence in the road. The experience was not individual or internal. It was shared and external and real in every way that matters. Every October I see posts from young people in Millhaven talking about going out to Widow's Crossing. They use the same language I would have used at 19. They're going to test it, prove it, debunk it, document it. They are smart and rational and not afraid of old stories. I recognize all of that. I was all of that. I want to reach through the screen and tell them something that will stop them, but I know how useless the words would be. You cannot give someone else the knowledge that experience burned into you. You can only describe it, and description is nothing compared to standing in the dark on old wood above black water while something you cannot explain answers you. If you find yourself in Millhaven, Oregon, and someone mentions Widow's Crossing with that particular gleam in their eye, the one that means they think it would be interesting to go and see, say no. Decline with whatever excuse comes naturally. Go to the party. Go home. Go anywhere that has light and warmth and the company of people who are not frightened. Some places have absorbed enough of what has happened in them that they have become something other than just places, something that waits, something that has learned, over a very long time, exactly how to respond when it is called. You might believe in that, or you might not. Your belief is not required. Whatever is at Widow's Crossing does not need you to believe in it any more than the creek needs you to believe in the water. It is there regardless. It was there before the story, and it will be there after everyone who knows the story is gone. And if you go to it and call out into the dark, it will answer you. Not because it is confused or lonely or searching for something it has lost, but because answering is what it does. Because something in that hollow between the bridge and the water has learned, across more than a century, that when the living come and call, they are offering themselves, and it has never once declined the offer. I grew up in a small town in rural Tasmania that I'll keep nameless, partly out of habit, and partly because the people involved deserve whatever privacy they can still claim. It was the sort of place where the distance between houses was short enough that you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall on a still night, and where the primary recreational activity for a significant portion of the adult population was the careful maintenance and distribution of other people's private information. The supermarket checkout, the football clubhouse, the school gate, the pub on a Friday, all of these functioned equally as clearinghouses for whatever anyone had recently discovered about whoever they had recently spoken to. I left for university in 2009, and in the months before I went, the story circulating with the most energy concerned a teenage boy I'll call Declan, a quiet, withdrawn kid a couple of years below me in school, who, according to the network of well-meaning gossips, had been struggling seriously with his mental health and had begun hurting himself. I'd occasionally seen him around town, dark hoodie regardless of the temperature, shoulders folded inward, headphones in, taking routes that avoided the main street where possible. The older women in town would track him with their eyes and murmur things that were equal parts concern and judgment. From what I observed, he mostly went to the second-hand bookshop on Crane Street and back, but the town had already written its own story about him and preferred it to the actual one. The incident I'm about to describe happened on a Saturday in early March, during the State of Origin football broadcast. One of our neighbors, A gregarious man named Gordon had rigged up a projector screen in his backyard and opened the space to whoever wanted to come, which turned out to be most of the street and several adjacent ones. There was a portable bar, a gas grill, children running around the edges of the gathering while the adults concentrated on the screen. I wasn't there myself. I'd taken my car to visit a friend in the next town. So what I know of the evening I've pieced together from my sister and from the accounts of several people who were present. Sometime around halftime, Declan's father slipped away from the gathering to check on something at home. What he found when he got there, or thought he found, sent him straight back to Gordon's backyard in a state of visible distress. He told his wife, and then several people nearby, that Declan's bedroom door was locked from the inside, that he had knocked and called out repeatedly without response, and that given everything the family had been dealing with recently, he was frightened about what that silence might mean. His wife went pale. Someone said they should call an ambulance. Someone else said they should break the door down first and call after. Within 4 minutes, approximately 3/4 of the people at the gathering had left it, streaming down the road toward Declan's family home in a loose, urgent crowd. The way people move when they believe time is the variable that matters most. The men at the front of the group hit the bedroom door with their shoulders until it gave. The room was empty. The window was open. It was later established that Declan, who was supposed to be home on a restriction following some minor incident at school, had simply climbed out the window to go meet friends, a fact he confirmed sheepishly when reached by phone. His father had not thought to check the window latch. In his fear and the haze of several drinks, the unlocked bedroom had read as a locked bedroom, and the silence had read as something it wasn't. Everyone stood in Declan's empty room, feeling the specific deflation of a crisis that turned out not to be one, and the relief was genuine and considerable. Here is the part one finds difficult to tell, even now, and I've told it very few times. Gordon and his wife Sandra had left the gathering along with everyone else, because they are decent people, and of course they had. Before they left, Sandra told their 12-year-old son Marcus to keep an eye on his baby sister, who was asleep in her bouncer chair in the living room. They would be back in a few minutes, she said. It was barely 100 meters down the road. Marcus was 12, not 2. The baby was asleep. It would be fine. They were gone for just over 30 minutes. When Sandra came through her front door ahead of Gordon, she made a sound that her neighbors described as unlike anything they had heard before or have heard since. She lost consciousness and struck the doorframe on the way down, opening a cut above her eyebrow that bled considerably. Gordon caught her before she hit the floor, and then looked up and understood why she had collapsed. Marcus had, at some point while his parents were gone, managed to spill a drink on his sleeping baby sister. Unable to find paper towels, and apparently operating in whatever dissociated logic had seized him in that moment, he had placed her in a microwave on the kitchen counter and turned it on. I am not going to describe what Gordon and Sandra found when they came home. I've heard descriptions from people who claim to have been told details by the emergency responders, and I don't repeat them, because the factual content adds nothing, and the image it leaves doesn't go away. What I will say is that the baby did not survive, and that the nature of what Marcus had done to her was the kind of thing that quietly reorganizes how a person understands the range of what is possible in a domestic space on an ordinary Saturday night. I grew up in a small town in rural Tasmania that I'll keep nameless, partly out of habit and partly because the people involved deserve whatever privacy they can still claim. It was the sort of place where the distance between houses was short enough that you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall on a still night, and where the primary recreational activity for a significant portion of the adult population was the careful maintenance and distribution of other people's private information. The supermarket checkout, the football clubhouse, the school gate, the pub on a Friday, all of these functioned equally as clearinghouses for whatever anyone had recently discovered about whoever they had recently spoken to. I left for university in 2009, and in the months before I went, the story circulating with the most energy concerned a teenage boy I'll call Declan, a quiet, withdrawn kid a couple of years below me in school, who, according to the network of well-meaning gossips, had been struggling seriously with his mental health and had begun hurting himself. I'd occasionally seen him around town, dark hoodie regardless of the temperature, shoulders folded inward, headphones in, taking routes that avoided the main street where possible. The older women in town would track him with their eyes and murmur things that were equal parts concern and judgment. From what I observed, he mostly went to the second-hand bookshop on Crane Street and back, but the town had already written its own story about him and preferred it to the actual one. The incident I'm about to describe happened on a Saturday in early March, during the State of Origin football broadcast. One of our neighbors, a gregarious man named Gordon, had rigged up a projector screen in his backyard and opened the space to whoever wanted to come, which turned out to be most of the street and several adjacent ones. There was a portable bar, a gas grill, children running around the edges of the gathering while the adults concentrated on the screen. I wasn't there myself. I'd taken my car to visit a friend in the next town. So what I know of the evening I've pieced together from my sister and from the accounts of several people who were present. Sometime around halftime, Declan's father slipped away from the gathering to check on something at home. What he found when he got there, or thought he found, sent him straight back to Gordon's backyard in a state of visible distress. He told his wife, and then several people nearby, that Declan's bedroom door was locked from the inside, that he had knocked and called out repeatedly without response, and that given everything the family had been dealing with recently, he was frightened about what that silence might mean. His wife went pale. Someone said they should call an ambulance. Someone else said they should break the door down first and call after. Within 4 minutes, approximately 3/4 of the people at the gathering had left it, streaming down the road toward Declan's family home in a loose, urgent crowd. The way people move when they believe time is the variable that matters most. The men at the front of the group hit the bedroom door with their shoulders until it gave. The room was empty. The window was open. It was later established that Declan, who was supposed to be home on a restriction following some minor incident at school, had simply climbed out the window to go meet friends, a fact he confirmed sheepishly when reached by phone. His father had not thought to check the window latch. In his fear and the haze of several drinks, the unlocked bedroom had read as a locked bedroom, and the silence had read as something it wasn't. Everyone stood in Declan's empty room, feeling the specific deflation of a crisis that turned out not to be one, and the relief was genuine and considerable. Here is the part one finds difficult to tell, even now, and I've told it very few times. Gordon and his wife Sandra had left the gathering along with everyone else, because they are decent people, and of course they had. Before they left, Sandra told their 12-year-old son Marcus to keep an eye on his baby sister, who was asleep in her bouncer chair in the living room. They would be back in a few minutes, she said. It was barely 100 meters down the road. Marcus was 12, not 2. The baby was asleep. It would be fine. They were gone for just over 30 minutes. When Sandra came through her front door ahead of Gordon, she made a sound that her neighbors described as unlike anything they had heard before or have heard since. She lost consciousness and struck the doorframe on the way down, opening a cut above her eyebrow that bled considerably. Gordon caught her before she hit the floor, and then looked up and understood why she had collapsed. Marcus had, at some point while his parents were gone, managed to spill a drink on his sleeping baby sister. Unable to find paper towels, and apparently operating in whatever dissociated logic had seized him in that moment, he had placed her in a microwave on the kitchen counter and turned it on. I am not going to describe what Gordon and Sandra found when they came home. I've heard descriptions from people who claim to have been told details by the emergency responders, and I don't repeat them, because the factual content adds nothing, and the image it leaves doesn't go away. What I will say is that the baby did not survive, and that the nature of what Marcus had done to her was the kind of thing that quietly reorganizes how a person understands the range of what is possible in a domestic space on an ordinary Saturday night. In the summer of 2009, I was working the night shift at a small gas station on a bypass road leading into Portland, Oregon. I was 18 years old, a recent high school graduate, trying to save up enough money to study design at a technical institute. The shift ran from midnight until 7 in the morning. The location was isolated enough that an entire night could pass with no more than 4 or 5 customers knocking on the door. At first, I welcomed this quiet. In fact, I enjoyed it. I would sit behind the counter with my phone, read, or occasionally sketch in a small notebook. The vast silence around me gave me a strange sensation that I was entirely alone in the world. The station itself was an old building with 2 fuel pumps out front that looked like they hadn't been replaced since the 90s. Inside, 3 narrow aisles smelled of plastic and cold coffee, and a row of refrigerators filled with drinks lined the back wall. The harsh fluorescent lighting stained everything an unsettling shade of yellow, making you feel as though you were in a place outside of time. Behind the counter, right next to the cash register, sat a wooden baseball bat that the station owner, a man named Gary, had bought. On my very first day, he told me in a calm voice, "If someone tries to rob you, give them whatever they want. Don't play the hero. This bat is just a prop to make you feel safe." Gary owned 2 other stations in the area and rarely stopped by, maybe once a week to collect the cash and make sure the locks were secure. The rest of the time, it was just me, the silence, and the yellow light. The nature of the job didn't change during the first few months. Truck drivers would stop to buy coffee and cigarettes. A few late-night travelers would pass through, and occasionally a wandering teenager would look for a candy bar. Everything was routine and predictable until Nicholas arrived. Nicholas was one of the regular drivers. He stopped by the station twice a week, on Mondays and Wednesdays, around 2:30 a.m. He was a man in his late 50s, heavily built, with short gray hair and an old cap bearing the Seattle Seahawks logo. He drove a long route between Salem and Seattle, and our station was one of his routine stops. We talked a lot over those months, about his wife who worked as a nurse, his son studying engineering, and the roads he had known in his youth. He made the long nights feel a little lighter. Then, Nicholas suddenly vanished. At first, I assumed his route had changed or that he was on vacation. But after 2 full weeks without a single trace of him, a nagging anxiety began to stir inside me. One night, a younger truck driver whom I had seen once or twice before walked in. As he was paying for his items, he asked if I had heard anything about a missing driver. I said no. He pulled out his phone and showed me a tweet circulating through online truck driver groups. It featured a picture of Nicholas, the exact same face I was used to seeing at dawn. The caption stated that he had failed to finish his last haul, and his truck had been found abandoned at a rest stop about 45 kilometers from here, with no sign of him. Anyone with information was urged to contact the police. At the very end of the tweet, I read, the last place he was spotted was a gas station on the bypass road outside Portland. This station. The next day, I called the police and gave my statement. I told them everything I knew about Nicholas, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact night I last saw him, as the nights all blended and dissolved into one another. They thanked me and said they would reach out if they needed more information. I hung up the phone feeling a strange heaviness in my chest, as if I should have remembered something important but couldn't. After that, the way I looked at everyone who entered the station changed. I began to hyperfixate on details, studying faces, logging car models in my memory, noting their clothes and the way they behaved. Most were just ordinary, exhausted travelers looking for coffee or a few minutes of warmth before getting back on the road. But there was one man, a man who began appearing regularly just a few days after Nicholas disappeared.
He would arrive around 3 a.m., always alone, driving an old, rusted gray Honda. He never bought much, just an energy drink or a pack of gum. But he would spend 20 to 30 minutes pacing the aisles incredibly slowly, picking items up and putting them back without ever placing them in a basket. At first, I thought it was just insomnia, a traveler killing time. But after the second night, I realized he was watching me. He would always position himself at the end of the aisle closest to the counter, pretending to study the shelves while his eyes remained fixed on me. Whenever our eyes met, he would grab the nearest item in his hand, head to the register, and mumble scattered words about the weather or something he had seen on the road. He never smiled. His voice was completely flat, as if he were reading from a script, and the way he stared made my skin run cold. One night he asked me, "What time does your shift end?" I shivered inside, but lied to him calmly, telling him that my supervisor arrived at 5:30 a.m. He nodded slowly and said, "Good. A place like this shouldn't have someone all alone all night." He paid for his drink and walked out, but he didn't leave. He parked his car in the furthest corner of the lot and sat there, his engine idling, for over 15 minutes before finally driving away. From that night on, I kept a baseball bat right next to me on the counter. He returned 3 more times over the following week. The pattern never changed. He would wander, watch, buy something trivial, and ask questions that made my soul shrink. He asked once if I lived nearby. Another time, he asked if strange things happened here at night. It felt as if he were trying to measure something inside me, testing my reactions. I called Gary and told him everything, describing the man in his car. He promised to swing by during the shift, but he never showed up at the right moment. Then came the defining night. It was an ordinary shift, unsettlingly quiet. No one had passed through for hours. At around 3 a.m., I heard the sound of a car engine approaching. Looking through the window, I saw it, the gray car. He didn't pull up to a pump to refuel. Instead, he parked right in front of the glass doors, keeping the engine running while he stared inside. I grabbed my phone and stood firmly behind the counter, my other hand resting on the wooden bat. He stayed like that for about 15 minutes, then turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. His steps toward the door were slow and deliberate, his hands shoved into his pockets. When he stepped inside and the chime of the small bell shattered the silence, my heart leaped. He looked around the empty store, then locked his eyes onto me. In a cold tone, he said, "I have an important question to ask you." I told him I was busy and that he needed to either buy something or leave. He ignored my words completely and slowly advanced toward the counter. He asked if the police had contacted me regarding the missing driver. I told him yes. He nodded as if he had anticipated that answer, then said, "In cases like this, it's best for a person not to get involved in things that don't concern them." I firmly told him that I didn't understand what he meant and that he needed to leave. He leaned his hands on the counter, loomed over me and said, "I'm just giving you some advice. This is a merciless area. Keep that in mind. A young kid like you shouldn't be out here alone." Then he asked me for the second time what time my shift ended. This time, I said loudly that my supervisor was in the back office. He gave a sharp, mocking smile and said, "I don't think that's true." Before I could lift the phone to dial the police right in front of him, he pushed off the counter, stood up straight, and said he didn't have time. At the door, he turned and said, "Good night, see you around." He walked out, but he didn't drive away. He parked his car in the furthest corner of the lot and killed the headlights. I could see his silhouette in the front seat, completely motionless. I called the police immediately. I told the dispatcher that a man was sitting outside the station, that he had implicitly threatened me, and that I felt I was in real danger. She told me she was dispatching a patrol car immediately and instructed me to lock the door and stay inside. I locked the door and dimmed some of the interior lights. I kept watching his shadow behind the glass, unmoving. Time dragged with an agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, I saw the blue and red lights approaching from down the highway. The exact moment the police cruiser turned into the parking lot, the gray car's engine roared to life, and it sped off heading north on the highway. The police tried to pursue it, but it had already gained too much distance. 2 officers came inside and took my full statement. I described the man and his vehicle with every detail I could conjure up. They asked for the license plate, but I apologized, explaining that I hadn't dared to step outside to look. They assured me they would step up patrols in the area. Over the following days, details of the investigation into Nicholas's disappearance began to trickle out. One of the officers who came to follow up on the interrogation told me that inside the abandoned truck, police had found clear evidence of a foul play, blood on the driver's seat and signs of violent struggle. Though no body had been recovered yet, he told me they believed someone was systematically targeting individuals working alone in isolated locations at night, and that there might be other victims who hadn't been discovered yet. I wanted to resign right that second, but financial necessity was stronger. Gary agreed to send another employee to share the shift with me, but it took him nearly 2 weeks and a half to find someone. That week and a half was the hardest period of my life. I slept during the day in fitful, broken intervals, and returned each night with a hesitant heart. I saw the gray car slowly drive past the station several times during that period, though it never stopped. About 2 months after Nicholas vanished, a local news reporter broadcasted a breaking update. A man named Ryan Caulfield had been arrested in Oregon on charges of multiple homicides targeting isolated night shift workers, truck drivers, security guards, and gas station attendants. His established pattern was to stalk his victims for weeks, studying their habits and schedules before striking. Evidence linked him to at least 7 documented murders, including Nicholas, whose remains were found in a dense forest not far from where his truck had been abandoned. When Ryan Caulfield's mugshot flashed on the screen, I felt as though the floor was being pulled out from under me. It was him, the man with the gray car. The cold questions, the smile that never reached his eyes. My body suddenly went weak, and I collapsed onto the nearest chair. The police later asked me to appear for a photo lineup. I made the identification, and my testimony became part of the prosecution's case. I stood in the courtroom detailing those nights, looking at him as he sat behind the defense table staring back at me with those exact same eyes, with the very same emptiness I had seen at the station. It was one of the heaviest moments I have ever endured. Ryan Caulfield was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. I resigned from the station the day after his arrest. I didn't think twice about it, nor did I wait to find an alternative job. I simply couldn't go back to that yellow light, the silence, and the chime of that doorbell. Gary gave me 2 weeks extra payout of appreciation, which kept me afloat until I found daytime work in a warehouse. I have never worked a night shift since that day, and I never will, no matter the incentive. Now I am 27. I moved away from Portland and started a new life in another city far away. But Nicholas remains in my mind. I think about his wife who was waiting for him, and his son who probably learned the news during his college semester. I think about all the others who never made it home. And I think about that night, about the blue and red lights reflecting on the station's glass doors, looking as though they were tearing the darkness apart. To this day, night sounds still make me snap to attention. I still scan the faces of strangers when walking down the street after dark. There are still moments when someone approaches me silently in an open area, that the smell of that station, its yellow light, and the sound of the bell come rushing back. Some fear never leaves you. It weaves itself into you until it becomes a part of how you think and how you view the world. And I hope no one ever has to go through what I did. When I attempt to summon that night from behind the passing years that have folded over and hidden so many of its details, I find that memory behaves like a river in foggy season. It shapes and reshapes itself until you begin to doubt exactly where the fear ends and what truly happened begins. This took place in the summer of 2019, when I was 15 years old. It is that age when you believe the entire universe is an easy conquest, so long as your friends are close by and your laughter is loud enough to chase away the ghosts. My friend Alara lived with her family in the Canterbury countryside in South England, in an old farmhouse surrounded by vast lands where woods of beech and oak alternated along the edges of the fields in a layout untamed by any human hand. I had known Alara since our first year of primary school, when we sat in the same row and drew the exact same pink house in art class. Her family belonged to that breed of people who maintained an authentic rural way of life, even as the world around them accelerated and changed. Her father raised sheep and grew barley. Her mother kneaded bread by hand and knew the name of every wild herb within a half-mile radius of the house. They loved long evenings, open-air campfires, and the freedom of children to roam within the property's boundaries, provided they returned before total darkness took hold. When Alara invited me to spend a weekend at their farm in the middle of that summer, I didn't hesitate for a moment. I packed my bag, adding a brand new flashlight I had bought specifically for the occasion. I had always found a sense of freedom in wide-open spaces at night that I could never quite find in the city. I arrived in the middle of the day. We spent the rest of the afternoon getting acquainted with the land alongside Alara, who knew every single inch of the way a reader knows their favorite words. She showed me the massive flat field stretching behind the house all the way to an old wooden fence that separated her family's land from the municipal forest. She pointed out the forest itself from afar, a self-contained, dark entity that began at the fence line and ended somewhere the naked eye could not see. Her father, Martin, spoke up as we ate dinner that evening. "I don't want to find either of you on the other side of that fence, no matter the reason. The forest is not our land, and at night, it behaves in ways I'd rather not describe." Alara laughed, claiming he was just trying to scare us. He simply smiled the smile of a father who knows far more than he lets on, and added nothing else. After dinner, we pulled out an old tent I brought from home, a tent I inherited from my father that carried the scent of time and every journey it had ever endured. We pitched it at the edge of the field, at a distance where the light from the back porch became a warm orange and a comfortable remoteness, close enough to grant you a sense of boldness, yet far enough not to leave you in utter desolation. We lit a small fire using what scraps Alara had prepared beforehand, and sat around it roasting cornbread, exchanging horror stories with that deliberate exaggeration that makes terror feel amusing and safe. Alara's younger brother, Felix, who was 10, was with us initially, brimming with enthusiasm for everything. Gradually, his energy waned just as the fire did, and by 11 o'clock, he had returned to the house, leaving the two of us completely alone with the night and whatever it held. The air was warm and heavy with a sort of green fragrance found only in places long separated from asphalt. We sat on a red and blue checkered blanket, watching the sky as the clouds surrendered a few stars. Everything was drifting toward a beautiful, perfect moment. Then I began to feel that nameless thing, that subtle prickling of the skin that hits you when you realize deep down that something is watching you. I said nothing at first. I stared at the black line of the distant trees, trying to rationalize every movement I saw as wind, a branch, or a stray small animal. But the prickling wouldn't stop. Instead, it intensified until it became a silent certainty that you dare not speak out loud, fearing that speaking would make it real. Then Alara spoke quietly without looking at me. "Do you feel something?" The humming arrived before I could answer her. At first, I attributed it to insects, or perhaps the distant sound of a car on a main road we couldn't see. But the sound was different. It lacked a definitive source that your eyes could trace. It existed in every direction all at once, resembling a musical pulse that belonged to no instrument you recognized. Its tempo rose slowly, fell, and then rose again, much like the breathing of something lost in deep sleep. We sat together, our ears strained, refusing to voice our fear, because voicing it would only make it larger. I grabbed the flashlight, switched it on, and swept its beams slowly along the tree line. My hand betrayed me with a slight tremor, causing the beam to shake along with it. Then the humming stopped. It ceased abruptly and completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. In the silence that followed, we noticed that the crickets and frogs had gone dead silent too, and the barking of Mr. Harvey's dog, our neighbor at the end of the field, had suddenly cut off. The silence felt like a physical mass pressing against our eardrums, a silence deeper than nature, intended by a distance difficult to measure except through pure instinct. Then we saw the first light. It was by the fence, at the exact point where the open field met the first trees. It was a soft orange glow, unstable, swaying sharply across short distances off the ground as if carried by unseen hands. Had you seen it on its own, you might have assumed it was a lantern held by someone walking, but there was no body. Moments later, a second light joined it. This one was a cold blue, like deep glass, moving in a fashion entirely distinct from the first, much calmer, slower, as if contemplating its path. The two lights orbited one another in a smooth circular motion, rising and falling, drawing near and drifting apart in a pattern that was hard to call random, because it bore the distinct marks of a dialogue. What terrified me and froze my soul in place was that their light did not cast upon anything. The grass beneath them remained dark. The trees behind them stayed black. The light illuminated only itself and nothing else, as though it existed in a different layer of reality, sharing the space with us. But not the rules. Ilera gripped my arms so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my skin, yet I felt no pain. We sat in a state of shared shock that predates fear, or perhaps surpasses it, moving to a place where the body has no prepared response. The blue light approached first, crossing the fence and halting a few meters into our side of the property. At that exact moment, we heard the sound of a snapping branch as it stepped on heavily, a sharp, clear sound that sliced through the silence like a knife. Then, both lights moved together toward us in synchronized pulses, maintaining a steady rhythm akin to the heartbeat of a massive, invisible creature. I found myself entirely unable to move, not out of fear alone, but due to that deeper type of paralysis that strikes when you encounter something that shatters your model of reality. A part of my mind desperately scrambled for logical explanations, producing one after another only to reject them all, while the oldest part of my being, the part inherited from ancestors who live in the wild, was barking a wordless warning. Then Ilera found her voice. She screamed for her father with every bit of air in her lungs, a scream that shattered the heavy silence like a hammer striking glass. In its wake, we heard the screech of the back door being thrown open violently, followed by Martin's voice yelling, "Who's out there?" And then the beam of his massive flashlight swinging in the darkness as he ran toward us through the grass. Martin was a man who had never compromised with fear in his life. He had served in the army for 2 years before inheriting the farm from his father, learning that you do not let unknown things hunt you. You hunt them. He had never stepped out into the open night air without a trusted companion, and that night he arrived holding the old double-barreled shotgun that hung on the kitchen wall all year round. As he drew close and his flashlight beam fully illuminated the field, the orange light drifted back slowly and extinguished instantly, without fading out gradually the way a fire does. As for the blue light, it shot toward the trees with a speed that made the eye doubt what it saw, vanishing behind the fence as if swallowed whole by the forest. The very second Martin reached us, the humming emerged briefly once more, then ceased entirely, and the crickets and frogs resumed their noises as if someone had unpaused the recording. We ran back to the house, Ilera and I stumbling over each other, entering the kitchen with shallow breaths. Ilera's mother, Dorothy, was waiting by the door, her face contorted with worry. She poured us tea and sat listening without interrupting as we described what we had seen in broken, overlapping words. Martin returned 15 minutes later. He entered with an unreadable expression, leaned his shotgun against the wall, sat on a kitchen chair, spun it backward, and faced us, a gesture that meant serious talk was coming. He said, "I found a circle in the grass by the fence." I didn't truly sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the blue light would float onto the screen of my eyelids, greeting me with a cold familiarity, like an old friend you aren't sure whether to love or fear. In every ordinary sound, the creak of a door or the rustle of a curtain, I kept hearing a potential extension of that humming. Early the next morning, before the daily hustle of the house picked up, I went out with Ilera and Martin to inspect the spot in the light of day. The circle was still clearly visible near the fence. The grass was bent inward in a smooth spiral, as if something had spun over with geometric precision rather than the random stamping of foot or the wind. What unsettled Martin even more was the center of the circle. It contained a ring of ash. There was no trace of fire beneath it, no scorching on the ground or the surrounding grass. It was ash placed there, or formed there, without singing a single thing around it. When I bent down to smell it, it carried no scent of smoke whatsoever. Instead, it possessed a sort of neutral chemical smoothness that made you feel something purely abstract had taken place. There were no footprints, no boot marks, No trace at all to indicate a human or an animal had stood there. Martin spoke in a voice quieter than usual. It's not the first time. We spent the rest of that day indoors. But by evening, curiosity achieved what fear could not. Alara suggested we return the fence, but this time bring Felix with us and keep the house doors within shouting distance. The three of us went out with powerful flashlights and long sleeves despite the heat, sitting at the edges, far from the circle which we avoided approaching by an unspoken agreement. We waited until the horizon plunged into complete blackness. But that night, nothing came. The fence remained a fence. The trees remained trees, and the crickets sang with monotony that meant the world was running by its usual rules. The circle under our flashlights looked a little less strange, just flattened grass and a patch of ash. We almost convinced ourselves that we had overinterpreted what we saw, but the summer had not closed its file. In the weeks following that night, stories began to accumulate like rainwater in a ditch. Two neighbors from the end of the agricultural road claimed they saw lights moving in the forest past midnight. Then, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hendricks swore she saw a shape as transparent as glass walking among the trees, accompanied by the exact same humming we had ascribed to her before she could even detail it. Word reached us that several dogs from surrounding farms refused to approach specific patches of the woods, stopping in an invisible line and refusing to cross no matter what their owners did. Someone else claimed his cows were returning from the pasture with wide, terrified eyes on certain days for no visible reason. What worried Martin more than anything else was what he noticed at the end of the summer. Nothing grew in the center of that circle. That small patch scorched by ash, or touched by whatever touched it, remained barren, while everything around it turned green again. The dirt there was ice cold to the touch even during the hottest hours of the day, causing your fingers to recoil on their own. Martin took a soil sample and sent it to a university professor he knew from his military days. The reply came 2 weeks later. Nothing unusual in the chemical composition, just ordinary soil in terms of elements and minerals. Yet nothing grew in it, not that autumn, nor the following spring, nor any time after. In the autumn, Martin decided to install security cameras directed toward the field and the fence. 3 high-definition cameras, carefully chosen and angled by his own hands. We began reviewing the footage every morning on his phone. Initially, nothing appeared except the field on a quiet night, and wild rabbits crossing at nature's usual pace. But exactly 2 weeks later, on the night of October 15th, we saw light flashes in the corner of the screen opposite the fence. Flashes that weren't insects or distant car headlights, because the nearest street was in the exact opposite direction. They were bluish flashes that appeared for a second and then vanished. Seconds later, the camera would record a strange visual noise, a jagged distortion rippling across the screen, as if something were interfering with the signal. On the night of the 23rd of that same month, the power cut out across the entire farm at exactly 2:13 a.m. with clockwork precision. The electricity returned 9 minutes later. When Martin opened the camera app in the morning, all 3 cameras had reverted to factory settings, their memory completely wiped. Martin met all of this with silence heavier than I expected from him. By the spring of the following year, Alara's family began packing up. They didn't announce it publicly or call it by name, but the preparation was happening quietly, just as difficult decisions do when you dare not say them out loud for fear of making them more real. The farm was sold late that year, remarkably fast and for a price far below its worth. Alara's family moved to Cornwall in the far southwest of England, far away from Canterbury's trees and its nameless lights. We never found out the name of the new buyer, but a few months later, Alara heard that the new owner had listed the house for sale again, and that the real estate agent was answering inquiries about the quick sale with brief, embarrassed responses that discouraged a follow-up question. I am 26 now. I studied environmental science, learning to classify phenomena, trace them back to their causes, and live comfortably within the vast space of what we do not yet know. I think a lot about that night, telling myself it was methane gas rising from deep, damp soil or static electricity from unseen storms or bioluminescent insects moving in a bizarre formation. I say this, and sometimes I even believe a fraction of it, but on nights when sleep deserts me and leaves me alone with what remains, I return to the blue light, Alara's pale face, and that physical silence that sat over the field like a living thing. And I return to a single question that has no comforting answer. What would have happened if we had crossed a fence and followed the lights? There are places that know something we do not, and there are questions that realize through instinct that their answers cannot be spoken in human tongue. When I pass near the Canterbury region today on a trip or a visit, I do not look toward those scattered farms at the edges of the forest. I don't need to. Memory knows its own way, and always arrives before you even... In the autumn of 2014, I was 27 years old and had just relocated to a small village in rural Wales, roughly an hour and a half away from Cardiff. I was taking up a teaching post at a countryside primary school that had been advertising for teaching staff for months. I had completed my degree in education 2 years prior and spent that interval bouncing between substitute teaching in Manchester schools and living in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates who shared a rare trait. Neither of them had ever washed a dish in their lives. When I spotted the job advertisement, complete with pictures of breathtaking scenery, a fixed salary, and low living expenses, I accepted the offer without visiting the place first. That was my first mistake. The village wasn't a village in the truest sense. It had a single petrol station, a general store that opened at unpredictable hours, a post office you had to interact with as if it were a clandestine bureau, and fewer than 200 residents scattered across hills and valleys whose boundaries were only known to those who had lived there a long time. The school drew in children from 4 neighboring districts, who arrived each morning in faded yellow buses that climbed up and down the rugged paths as it defied the laws of physics. I rented a house at the end of a dirt track, about 3 kilometers from the village center. The house was old with all the charm of age. 2 bedrooms ending in a narrow corridor, a kitchen that wafted the center with soaked in time, and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle, leaning toward the ground as if it had grown weary of standing for so long. The landlord was a man who lived in a more distant county. He gave me his phone number and said succinctly, "Call if something breaks, but otherwise you're fine." My closest neighbor lived in a modest house about 200 meters down the road. He told me his name was Liam, and I met him on the first day while I was unloading my boxes from the car. He emerged from a side trail walking calmly, hands shoved in his pockets, with a smile that seemed practiced beforehand. He was in his mid-30s, lean with a sort of quiet strength, his skin weathered by the sun and wind, and his eyes stared at you with an intensity that was slightly more than you'd expect from a casual glance. He offered to help me carry the heavier boxes, and I accepted because I was exhausted and because refusing would have made things socially complicated. He spoke of the area with the familiarity of someone who lives there and sees nothing else. He told me which roads flooded during rains, where mobile signal dropped out, and that I should keep a landline as a backup. He mentioned that he worked in construction, odd shifts and fluctuating hours, and that if I ever needed anything, I shouldn't hesitate to ask. I thanked him, making sure to keep the distance between us strictly neighborly. I had learned early on that some people interpret warmth differently, and I wanted the boundaries to be crystal clear from the start. The first few weeks passed with a quietness that felt like convalescence after a long illness. I kept busy setting up my classroom, memorizing my students' names, and learning the geography of the village and its people. The isolation didn't bother me as much as I had anticipated. After the relentless noise of Manchester, this rural silence felt like absolute luxury. I would sit on the porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and a book, listening to the wind through the trees and the sound of birds that didn't stop in this area even after dusk. Liam stayed within his boundaries. I would see him from time to time, coming and going at irregular hours. His truck would sometimes arrive at midnight and leave before dawn. He would wave whenever he caught us outside at the same time, but he never tried to strike up conversations or linger. I was grateful for that. Then I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily chalked up to innocent explanations. Vehicles passing down our track at 2 or 3 in the morning, their headlights cutting across my bedroom wall and waking me. The sound of footsteps on the gravel, sometimes muffled, urgent conversations followed by doors slamming shut with force. Once, I heard the voice of a woman speaking agitatedly, followed by a sudden silence that was far more unsettling than the voice itself. I told myself it was none of my business. People have their own complicated lives. Until that night in late September. It was around 11 in the evening, and I had gone to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. The kitchen window looked out toward Liam's property, and as I stood by the sink, I spotted two figures in the driveway leading to his house. Liam and another man I had never seen before were both struggling to carry a heavy object between them. An automated floodlight mounted on the side of his house had triggered as they approached, and in that stark light, I saw what was in their hands with absolute clarity. At first, I thought it was a rolled-up carpet, the large, thick kind that requires two people to manage. But the way it slumped in the middle, that pliancy unique to objects possessing an internal, shifting weight, caused something in my gut to snap awake before my brain even fully registered it. They kept stopping every few paces to adjust their grip, speaking in clipped words I couldn't catch. Eventually, they heaved it together into bed of a pickup truck I didn't recognize, quickly draped a thick tarp over it, and exchanged a few brief words before the stranger drove away alone. Liam headed back inside with uneasy strides. I stood by the sink for a long time. My heart was pounding at a speed that was entirely uncalled for if what I had witnessed was ordinary. I tried to rationalize the scene every way I could. Maybe he was throwing away an old rug. Maybe he was helping a friend move. Maybe I was blowing things out of proportion because crime dramas had warped my way of thinking. I convinced myself of this and went back to sleep, though it took quite some time. Weeks rolled by, and the matter had almost faded from my memory. Then, on a cold autumn afternoon, I pulled up at a shop in a nearby town to pick up a few necessities and spotted a piece of paper taped to the exterior glass. It was a missing persons flyer. Anna Ferguson, 23 years old, worked as a waitress at a diner on the main road. She was last spotted on a Friday night, leaving work. The photograph showed a girl with dark hair and a reassured smile, the kind of face that makes you feel as though you already know her. I froze in front of the flyer for what felt like an endless moment. Then I returned to my car and sat inside without starting the engine. The carpet, the way it sagged, the haste with which they hid it. That night, I didn't sleep. I brought up every innocent explanation in my mind and tore it down. Over the following days, I noticed that Liam's visitors had increased. Different cars at bizarre hours, brief encounters in the driveway without entering the house. Something about the cadence of it all flew in the face of what I knew to be normal social visits. I didn't know what to do with this feeling. Call the police and say what? That my neighbor moved the carpet at night? Then, on an evening in mid-October, there was a knock at my back door. The back door that faced the woods behind the house. The door that absolutely no one ever knocked on, because no one ever approached from that direction. A single knock, then silence, followed by two heavier raps. I stood dead center in the room, my pen hovering over a marking sheet, entirely motionless. Then I rose slowly toward the door. Through the small window pane, I saw him, Liam. He was standing on the concrete slab of the back porch. His face held nothing of the smile from the day I moved in. It was rigid in a way that made his features look less like an expression and more like a grim decision. I opened the door, but kept the security screen door locked between us. He stared at me heavily and began in a calm that was deeply unnerving. He said he had noticed me watching his property, that he'd seen me looking out the window at night, and that he knew I had seen what happened that night with the carpet. He said he wanted us to have an understanding. I felt my mouth go dry. I tried to keep my voice even and told him I had no idea what he was talking about, that I lived my own life and didn't care what my neighbors did. He shook his head slowly and said he hoped that was true, because things would be much simpler for everyone if I just forgot what I saw. He said the situation was complicated, that there were elements to it I couldn't possibly comprehend, and that making phone calls or asking questions would be a very bad idea. He never raised his voice. He never uttered an explicit threat. But every word carried a weight that knew exactly how to land in the right spot. Then he said in a tone that sounded entirely pleasant, "Have a good evening." He turned and walked back toward the property with slow, unhurried steps, like a man who knows there is absolutely no need to rush. I shut the door. I locked the screen. I turned both keys. I pulled the curtains over every single window in the house. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand until dawn. Every hour, I weighed the two arguments. The first, call the police right now. The second, you are entirely alone at the end of the dirt track. If you call and they come and question him and then leave, you're still left here with him and a mere 200-meter gap between you. What would stop him then? But every time I wavered, Anna Ferguson's face would rush back into my mind. That smile on the missing flyer, and something inside me would harden. In the morning, I drove to school like a sleepwalker with my eyes open. I taught my classes while hearing myself speak from a distance. During the lunch break, I went out to the car park, dialed a non-emergency police number, and told them everything. The carpet, the night, the missing woman, and the words he had spoken at my back door. 2 days later, a detective constable came to my house. He sat in the kitchen while I recounted everything in detail. He noted it down in his booklet and told me they would look into it, advising me to keep my doors locked and to call immediately if Liam approached me again or if I noticed anything unusual. Over the following week, I noticed police cars occasionally passing down our road, stopping for a few minutes before moving on. I felt safe and terrified all at once, because I knew Liam saw what I saw and that he was capable of doing the math. Then, on a Wednesday morning, I woke up to the sound of idling engines and people walking outside. From my bedroom window, I saw 3 police cruisers and an unmarked white van parked in front of Liam's house. Officers in tactical gear were deployed across the property, some stationed at the doors, others entering and exiting carrying boxes and tag bags. Yellow tape was being strung across the land. That evening, the detective returned to my house. He informed me that they had executed a search warrant based on my report and other pieces of intelligence they had been gathering on the property. They uncovered evidence linking Liam and others to a human trafficking ring operating across 3 regions in South Wales and Western England. The house was being used as a safe house where victims were held for short periods before being moved. They discovered documentation, restraints, and items that tied Liam and his associates to multiple victims, including Anna Ferguson, whose remains had been discovered in a woodland 35 kilometers away. The detective told me that my report had been pivotal in launching the investigation. I didn't feel anything resembling heroism. I felt sick, weighed down by a bizarre guilt. The guilt of hesitation. The guilt of the nights that had elapsed between seeing that carpet and making the call. Liam was arrested along with 4 others. The case went to court, and I testified to what I had seen that night and what had taken place at my back door. I sat in the courtroom and looked at Liam across the dividing space. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, and his accomplices received similar sentences. The prosecutor told me later that the evidence recovered from the property allowed them to identify other victims who might never have been found otherwise. I moved out of the house a week after the trial concluded. I simply couldn't stay on that dirt track, knowing what had been happening just 200 meters away from me all those months. I moved back to a major city and took a job at a school in a bustling suburb where neighbors know one another and the police station is minutes away. I am 37 now. I teach mathematics at a secondary school, and my life is quiet in the best sense of the word. The kind of quiet where you know its source and can trust it. But I still think about that night, about the 2 men beneath the floodlight and the weight that hung between them. I think about what could have happened had I let fear win, had I convinced myself that it wasn't my business, and that intervening carried too high a personal cost. But most of all, I think about Anna Ferguson, the girl with a reassured smile on a piece of paper taped to the glass of a cold shop front. And I wonder if I had called that very same night, the night I saw the carpet instead of weeks later, would anything have changed about how it ended? That question never truly leaves. It sits quietly in the corner of my memory, demanding nothing more than to be remembered from time to time, a stark reminder what seconds of decision mean when they are weighed on the true scales.